Welcome back. Now let's get the show on the road. Well, as you heard from that report, on Thursday, the President, Muhammadu Buhari, presented a proposed budget of 16.39 trillion for the year 2022 to the National Assembly. So we're going to look at the estimated budget and the impact of borrowing more money on the federal government and the economy of Nigeria, as well as the impact of that budget proposal on Nigerians, as in Nigerians, their standard of living, as well as their cost of living. We have two knowledgeable guests with us. Dr. Biodun Adedikpe, Management and Financial Consultant, is here with us in the studio. Good morning.
Good morning. Yes.
And joining us virtually is Mr. Charles Iyore, Principal Partner, Dion and Associates, and he's joining us from Kent. Good morning.
Good morning.
How are you today?
Fine, thank you.
Good to have you with us.
Well, I'm happy to be here.
My Lord.
Dr. Adedikpe, to your mind, what are the highlights of this budget? 16.39 trillion, out of which we're looking to borrow about 6 trillion. That is the common man's reaction. We're going to borrow more money, and we're going to borrow 6 trillion. How are we going to pay back all this money?
Okay. Thank you so very much for that. I think, when it comes to national budget, there are some fundamentals that determine how we interpret it and what Nigerians should expect.
Okay.
So the first is the premise, and that talks to what has been the journey so far in 2021 as a background to 2022 we are projecting for. So, and of course, if you look at that, as of July this year, we're actually running fiscal operations at a deficit of 4.17 trillion naira as of July this year. So now that talks to the reality of the economic environment we are in. Yes, we generate revenue quite all right. It is growing, no doubt, because the price of crude oil this year has firmed up. In actual fact, it's in line with what we projected at the beginning of the year. In fact, above what we projected. Because we then projected about $72 per barrel. But now it's testing $80 per barrel. Now, that's one premise. Revenue improved, but it has not been able to catch up with our spending. Okay. Secondly, we now talk about the assumptions. So, and the question there is, how realistic are these assumptions? And of course, oil is still a major factor in our budgeting.
Benchmark 57.
Exactly, benchmark $57 per barrel. Production 1.88 million barrels per day, which of course is a reflection of Nigeria's allocation from OPEC Plus and the reality of global economy. Is it going to grow further in 2022, which we also expect as more and more countries get over the third wave of COVID-19, and of course the world is moving gradually towards herd immunity, especially in the advanced countries. Okay, so if that happens, the major economies will also grow. That creates demand for hydrocarbons, and that falls back on Nigeria with our premium crude or burning light. Okay, so that given. Then we now ask ourselves, and that is the big question you actually asked, what are the priorities in this budget? Now, in that, there are two heads. The first is we have a national development plan for 2021 to 2025. So ordinarily, a budget is an implementation tool. So the first question that we ask is this budget taken from that plan? So if it is, then we are in the right direction. Then the budget also focus generally is on economic growth and of course sustainability. So how does that happen? And that brings us to the priorities. The budget sets 6 priority areas. Okay? First, it talks about diversification. And when you interrogate the numbers, you actually will find that the 10.13 trillion that federal government will have for spending in 2022 that is revenue projected to be generated, actually has oil less than non-oil revenue, if you look at it. So in fact, oil there is about 30%, thereabout, of that 10.13 trillion. So that, for me, is already a direction, an improvement over what we had historically. So that process of diversifying the revenue is already in process. I mean, it's already ongoing. So that's on the one hand. Now, the budget also talks about committing resources, financial resources, into critical infrastructure. And that is the connection to the future. So in which case, if truly we commit more funds to critical infrastructure, that's like 5 trillion in that budget, and we go for capital expenditure. Okay? So if 5 trillion goes into capital projects, that means critical infrastructure is getting the proper attention it requires. We've been talking about deficit
We hope.
for so many years. Okay? But there's a challenge there. It's not so much as allocating that much for capital spending. But how do we extract value? Because I listened to your comments earlier on.
That's it.
About the report of the Auditor General.
We'll come to that.
Okay.
We'll come to that.
So that would be
But let's take
Yes.
Mr. Iyore's opening comments on this. Are you on the same page with Dr. Adedikwe on the presentation that the president has made of the budgets that he laid before the National Assembly?
Good morning, and good morning, Dr. Adedikwe. Great effect. Brilliant young man who was first class in economics. But what I always do basically is that when we do analysis like this, I want the man on the streets to know what we're talking about. Otherwise, we're just plucking figures from the sky and confusing them the more. So what is a budget? So it's a budget in the House, it's a budget in the local government, and then there's the federal budget. So start with the budget in the House. So what you're saying basically is that you have an idea of what you need to spend and have an idea of what you have, and you have to lay it out properly. That's what the budget is. Then, you then have to realize, how did this budget come about? The budget is an instrument of state's execution of its promises. Before you become a government, you write what is called a letter of intention, which is called the manifesto, because you don't have all the facts. When you get into government, you then run with what is called a budget, which is law. Therefore, it must be based fairly and firmly in reality. Otherwise, you're taking everybody in the wrong. So let's take Madam Alero's house. Every year, every day, they spend 3 tubers of yam to have their favorite pounded yam regularly. And the father decides, look, let's do better today. I'm going to have to borrow 2 more tubers of yam, so you can all have 5 tubers of yam for food. Now, if we tell you that, because you all work hard, the money that the yams I've taken from my friend, I can return, which is a good assumption. The second one you then do is to say, look, because I brought 5 tubers of yam, now instead of 3, does not mean you must waste the 3 that you have. Because if you waste the 3 that you have, all of those projections will be wrong. So like you said, the budget is based on a few assumptions. One of the clear assumptions you hear about is the value of the oil and how much they're going to sell it. But that's only one very simple and very little assumption. There are very many assumptions that you need to make, and because there are very many variables. And the more of those variables the government can control, the better it can manage this budget. But if it allows itself to lose all those controls...
Mr. Ayer, my sincere apologies. I'd like us to pace up a little on this conversation because we don't have so much time. But on this assumption, I have a question for you and Dr. Adedikwe. In the budget speech that the president read, he said, and I quote, actual revenues were 34% below target as of July 2021, and he gave reasons. Next item, the federal government's share of oil revenue totaled 570.23 billion naira as of July 2021, which was 51% below target. 2 assumptions fell way below target. interestingly, in the year we're looking at ahead, we're expecting to spend more, borrow more, assume more. Are you optimistic?
You see, I like the question you're asking, but what we're doing is not an elite preserve. The person on the street needs to understand what we're talking about. And I've told you basically, like Dr. Adegbe has told you, if your assumptions are not sound, you will not get to where you're going. So I was going to tell you what those assumptions are. You stopped us in the track. I told you one of the assumptions is the price of oil. The other assumption is the strength of your currency. And the other main assumption, which I has already told you, is the priorities of what you intend to do. So I wasn't part of that budgeting process. So it would be unfair of me to be talking about whether the percentages are right or wrong. All I want to do is to give you the consumer analysis so you yourself can come to those conclusions as to whether those are right or wrong. Now, he's giving us a figure about exchange rates. And the minister has also talked about inflation. But he's not talking about inflation as targets. He's talking about inflation as a measure. When you want to run the budget, you must set inflation as a target. In other words, you don't want to pump too much money into the system. 2, will your currency hold value? If your currency is not holding value, it means that your take-home pay will not get you home. And the whole question unravels, which is why you have labor unrest. So I'm saying that the key thing for you is not just to jump into the area they're talking about. I don't have those skills, and I expect you not to have those skills. But I want to give you the ability to interpret that properly so you come to a defined and informed position.
You've given us all the homework, clearly. You've given everyone.
You said that you're ready to listen.
My sincere apologies. We really don't have more time, but I would like us to cover as much as possible of this so that, as you said, the Nigerian can understand the issues and be able to and know what to expect. So, Dr. Adedikwe, I'm going to put the same question to you. On the one hand, actual revenue fell short by 34%. Oil revenue fell short by 51%. And our assumptions seem to have risen this year, and revenue assumptions also have risen. So I'm just wondering, if we had such a shortfall in the previous year, in this ongoing year, what's the assurance for the year ahead? Are there structures that you think will help governments to be able to achieve those targets?
Yeah, thank you. That's a very important question you raised there. And the way we look at this is from the 2 perspectives to revenue. The oil revenue, which of course is driven by those 2 major numbers, the price and production, vis-a-vis export. Because actually the export of crude oil in Nigeria is a derivative of what we produce. Because the typical pattern, check the pattern in the last 40 years plus, is that there is a provision of about 450,000 barrels per day. Anytime you look at our figures, export figures, it is always production less 450,000 barrels. So which means if we talk about production at 1.88 million barrels per day, that means what we actually will generate revenue from that is talking about foreign earnings will be 1.88 less 0.45. So that would be the export figure we expect in 2022. So now we take that vis-a-vis the average price of crude oil at $57 per barrel. The actual price can be higher, can be lower. Okay? This is just an average assumption. So but it's to generate some numbers to look at. So it doesn't actually mean that is what we see in reality. So the question now is, what can make this sort of numbers we're looking at happen?
Yeah.
A lot of that will depend on what happens to the 2 largest economies in the world today. That the US economy and the Chinese economy.
Wow.
So if they grow strongly in 2022, then there are chances that other economies like that of India and the rest of them can also generate the demand for hydrocarbons. Okay? But whether we like it or not, the next 10, 15, 20 years, the world will still be using fossil fuel. That's the reality. If you look at interrogate alternative energy and what is trending there. So it then means that there's a likelihood that if that demand grows and the global economy also, begins to grow after the recovery from COVID-19, then there's a likelihood that that demand will also sustain our expectation.
Okay.
Now, when it comes to non-air revenue, it's a different ballgame. And that is where I have an observation there. A remark made yesterday by the chairman of FRS with respect to taxes. And he said, oh, only 41 million Nigerians out of 200 million. I said, no, that's not correct. Should be talking about 41 million out of 58.6 million who are those who are gainfully employed. And of course, I take that data from the unemployment report of the NBS for third quarter of 2020. Okay, people that are in employment in Nigeria were 58.6 million. So if we go by the 41 million he referenced, that means the gap we need to bridge then is about 17 million that are in employment, but are not yet in the tax basket. So what the budget also at implementation will be focused on is how do we get more of these people into the tax basket?
And how do we even now expand the tax basket by creating more employment?
Precisely.
Which now speaks to the need to energize Nigeria's production capacity.
Fantastic.
Many people are talking about the fact that the OPS is unable to have a pleasurable business environment. Despite all of the efforts of ease of doing business and all those things, you know, the private sector is still challenged. We are not a producing economy, which is one thing that Mr. Ayore has also mentioned, that if we are a producing economy, the economy will do better, then micro, small, and medium enterprises will be able to produce and generate jobs. Do you see these budgets going in that direction in any way?
Well, you know, there is something we must also address our minds to. A budget is an announcement of intentions.
But it is going to become a law, Dr.
Yes, it will become a law.
That will govern our lives for the next year.
Unfortunately, we have never treated the budget as a law in Nigeria.
Really?
Because if we really treat it as a law, that means by the time you end the year and you bring out a scorecard, any variance between the reality of accomplishments or achievements and that budget should become a subject for conversation and interrogation. So we should be talking about that. And that brings me to a remark you made earlier before this segment started. And that is, historically in Nigeria, we only talk about execution of budget in terms of we spent this much. We don't place emphasis on the deliverables. And that is what I see.
The value that
we get out of it. And that is what connects to the question you asked. How can we create jobs and also create wealth?
Okay. Mr. Ayore, he has mentioned, well, both of them have spoken about the non-oil sector as a means of generating funds. From what we have been told on this program several times, some business MSc people have come here and told us how difficult the terrain is for them to do business. Those who are in export, some of them were here 2 weeks ago when we were talking about Apapa ports or the ports in Lagos, and they told us the myriad of problems they're having, how their goods, sometimes their produce never gets to the port, they rot on the way to the port. How can we improve our economy in such a way that the non-oil sector is also able to contribute meaningfully to the economy?
Thank you very much. You know, I always say you need to define what you want to say. For me, this is perhaps one of the best budgets we've had in a very, very long time. Best budget. Because the minister said clearly she intends to complete and collect her collections so that the gap between the supplement the government has to make in using dollar as an anchor is reduced. That is phenomenal. And I expect that to go beyond to say all the linkages that support production will be strengthened. And I think this is where we need to support her and her team about what they are doing. So when you talk about all those things, all of those figures are here. I like to do models. If you talk about the performance of an economy, you now ask yourself, what are those units of the economy? When you're talking about a car, you know whether the car is fast or slow. When you're talking about an economy, You're talking about an ecosystems. Do the ecosystems work? Can the currency hold value? Can your salaries wage you on? Is the countryside decimated? Those are the key issues. And I believe she wanted to begin to address those issues. And we must hold her to that account. Rather than talking about her historical perspective and how well the external performance will lift our own economy. I'll give you an example. This one sold a tuber of yam in Benue last year for 5 naira. And this year, you say you cannot pay him 50 kobo for it. Will he remain there? That's where she's going. And that's where we need to support her to ensure that those linkages are built, that the ecosystems work, that the liquidity anchor of the dollar for currency creation in central bank is stopped, that those who hold offices by election are champions of development and they're not just drawing salaries and doing nothing. Otherwise, there'll be nothing to budget. So when we talk about those things, which is why I kept telling Mr. Makinde, if people don't understand the perspective they're talking about, it is difficult for them to work. This budget is saying, okay, we're going to borrow 2 tubers of yam, but the 3 that we have, use them properly. Now we must hold them on that one and make sure they move down that road effectively so they have work and results to do. Like I said earlier on, you don't announce inflation rates as a result. You set inflation targets and use that to determine how money goes into your system. Thank you.
And how would you suggest that Nigerians would cooperate with the Federal Minister of Finance, just as you have said? Because the only thing that comes to people's mind is we're borrowing too much. And the narrative is quite significant. It's impressed on many people's minds. And we're still going to borrow again to fund this same budget. So how, in your opinion, should Nigerians cooperate with the Minister of Finance?
It must start with central bank. The volume of money that is translated into naira to support the currency must stop. Because what you have basically is not a market. You say this is how much dollars you have, this is how much naira you need to generate, and you just do a translation. That's not the market. And we said that a long time ago when even Dutch auction was there. For the first time, the Treasury is standing up to the system. I give her credit for that. I give him, Ben Akabozi and the minister, credit for that. The Treasury needs to set the standard and set the boundaries. And they are beginning. That's where I want the discussion to go. I want the discussion to see why are all those industries in Ibadan, Lubeju, Ikeja, where have they all gone silent? Those are the issues. And when you try and use differential interest rate, exchange rate to correct them, you cause even more distortion. This is the first time
you've answered my question, Mr. Yore, and thank you for that. But Dr. Adedipe, a sizable number of Nigerians, we said earlier, are young. And a good number of them have no jobs. And they are potential taxpayers.
That's right.
If they have jobs. I mean, with the figure you quoted the other time, if about 60, let's say 50% of the people who have the capacity to make money do not have jobs, it's a loss for the federal government because they will not be able to raise any money from anywhere. So how do you see us helping government in that regard? Because, I mean, reference the ease of doing business environment and the potential if people have jobs.
All right, thank you so very much for that. My response to it will come from this perspective that when you pair economic activities, they fall in 3 planks. There is the production, there is consumption, and there is exchange. You may call it trade that connects the 2 of them. So which means for you to create value, you must be involved in those 3 areas, all right? Now, the big question for us in Nigeria today is, what do we consume? In fact, if you interrogate the data, the latest data available, as at the first half of this year, Nigeria imports monthly, average monthly import bill, 2.3 trillion naira. For real. That data is from MBS, not an estimate from me. Now that translates into about $5.61 billion every month we spend on imports. So that means that the average Nigerian consumes mostly what is imported. So the question then is there a possibility for us to shift that narrative? And in fact, it reflects here in our conversation. We are not wearing suit and tie and shirt. Even though the fabric might not be manufactured in Nigeria, but somebody made it here. So added value. Okay? So in which case, our consumption needs to change. We must deliberately start to consume what is made in Nigeria. The government will lead that, which they actually did in a presidential order that was signed in 2017. Okay? That said 30% of federal government's expenditure, which connects to this budget we're talking about, to be committed to buy things that are made in Nigeria.
But, Dr. Dedekwe, how many things are made in Nigeria?
That's where I'm going to.
Mr. Yora
Okay,
said, our factories are all
Alera,
silent.
it's
like we're going round in circles.
I will share just, it's a story, reality.
In half a minute.
Yes.
We have to close
now.
now.
10 years ago, I sat briefly in the economic management team of President Jonathan, just for 3 months. One thing we started then, which I think is still an idea that Nigeria can begin again today. We told ourselves that let's do something about the automotive sector. So we now interrogated different existing players in that sector. But this is important for Nigeria. When we had an interaction with Innocence, the first question he asked us is, did you come to see me because you learned that the Ghanaian government's delegation came to me 2 weeks ago to persuade me to relocate my factory to Ghana?
Ouch.
And we said no, that we thought one of the ways to resolve this unemployment issue and low productivity is to look at entities that are in that sector that we can now ask them, what do you need? So it goes beyond talking about ease of doing business. We need to interrogate them and engage them. That's what the Ghanaian government did. So we have to now come up with recommendations that will keep Innocence here, rather than us losing him to Ghana. 10 years ago, the same thing can be done today. And that will change the narrative.
I could go on and on that, but it's your...
It's a pity we haven't really scratched the surface yet, but we don't have enough time. I just have to thank Dr. Biodun Adedikwe, who is a management and financial consultant, who was with us in the studio, as well as Mr. Charles Iore, who joined us virtually. He is the principal partner, Dion and Associates, Kent. Thank you very much for joining us this morning, Mr. Iore. Sunrise will return in just a moment, and we hope that we'll have enough time to dig into that subject.